I ask you one question to start with?
Yeah.
You read law.
Yeah.
And of course, I could see you had a good time doing law and you did well at it. What made you decide you didn't want to spend the rest of your life devising tax avoidance schemes for rich people?
That would be a really useful skill to have right now, to be honest. Tax avoidance schemes, that is. Honestly, I don't. I think this is very much a product of being the child of immigrants, which is, ambitious immigrants, and certainly Nigerian immigrants of a particular time, which is there were three options, which is lawyer, doctor, engineer, which is very much skilled professions where there was a perception that which you could climb the ladder in a very particular way, and it's just about passing the exams and avoid some of the worst obstacles that systemic issues breed. So I had zero interest in science and blood and any of that stuff. So medicine seemed very much out of it. And engineering kind of the same way, though my dad was an engineer. But I loved LA law. That was the thing. I figured I was fairly, argumentative, and I really loved LA law. And there was so in terms of like feeling like there was sort of constraints on what I could go to university to do, because I also loved English and history, and those were like not proper job things. So I was like, I can do law. So I convinced myself that, but I was always clear I wanted to write. And but I also felt that the law was interesting enough. It was about people, it was about conflict, which is what drama is really about. And so I thought, okay, I could probably do this. And then once I was there, I think we went off to Slaughter and May one year, and I was like, oh wow, absolutely not. This cannot be the rest of my life. But I found the law degree to be incredibly useful on so many levels as I've progressed in my career, very much in terms of just from a story and narrative point. Every case you read, if you read the judgment, it is about people navigating obstacles, navigating conflict, which is kind of fundamentally what drama is about. Then so many in LA, so many writers, so many producers started off as lawyers, because again, there's such a, when you're putting together a big production, there's so many contractual elements of it. And I have an entertainment lawyer who does my deals and stuff, but you still look over them, you still have a thought. Till this day, there are points in my contract when I'm like, I will read it over, I will skim it over, but I'll be like, if I miss this, Laura Hayana would never forgive me, because she was my contracts tutor. And there is that stuff that just sticks with you. So I think it was, I studied it because I thought it could be, I studied it because my parents really wanted me to do that other than over English and history. But it was a great cohort our year. I really, and I think what was great having you as a tutor was you weren't particularly fussed about what we did, so long as we did the work, and enjoyed it, and like did stuff outside of, I didn't feel like you would be particularly concerned if I didn't go to Slaughter and May as soon as I graduated. And so that kind of opened up a sense in which I had a great, strong degree that I could always fall back on. And that was important in the first sort of decade of my career, or 5 years, where you write one thing and then you don't earn any money for ages, and you're sort of like, oh my God, will I ever make it in TV? There was always this sense of like, you can just go do the your CP, whatever, not a conversion, because I had a degree, but I could always go back to law school, finish off, and go get a training contract somewhere. And that, I think, gave me a secure footing on which to kind of propel my other ambitions.
Yeah. Okay. So why you went into television first, didn't you?
When I graduated, in terms of the UK, there wasn't then, and there still isn't really a massive film industry. So I really wanted to be a film writer and to write prose and fiction and short stories, but there wasn't a film industry. But there is a television industry, and there was like the BBC. And so it was just, I think with your first job, you have a goal, but ultimately, because I was also being, again, going back to the parents of it, I said I didn't get any offers for training contract. Truthfully, I didn't apply for a single training contract. But so there was a kind of ticking clock on my head of like me pretending I was applying to like Allen and Overy, which I wasn't. So it was just about getting that first job in. And my first job was a producer. She was based in Chelsea, and she'd made one show, but she always hired her assistants through the Oxford Career Service, which is why I found her name. And so I went to work for her, and it was a tiny company, but that meant I just got to learn. When you've got a small company like that, you're sort of helping with contracts, you're helping with business affairs, you're reading scripts, you're reading all that stuff. So it was a tiny job, largely unpaid. They paid my travel. I did that for 3 months, but then it was a beginnings into TV, and she'd made a show for the BBC. So when I applied for a BBC assistant job, development assistant as opposed to personal assistant, I kind of used that. So TV had at least more opportunities to get in, and so I kind of progressed that way really, and sort of built most of my career in TV more than anything, because the other stuff is still so tricky to break through properly.
Yeah, so we have some questions planned. I guess my first question is sort of, can you describe your approach to screenwriting? How do you go from initial concept to a finished script?
A lot of it is just ruminating. You have an idea, or you think, oh, I would want to see that. Or why hasn't anyone made that? Or God, I've just watched this film and that's a terrible version of this. This is how I would have done it. So it's usually ruminating a lot on ideas and then thinking, you know, so sometimes I come up with a concept. I'm just like, what if this person travels back in time to kill this person for this reason? But other times it's just a character. But I think my process, I mean, in a way, your question is interesting because you said initial concept to finished script, and there's never a finished script is the answer, because a screenplay is not like a novel. A screenplay is a blueprint for a lot of other people to start their job. So I guess so often it's just like, okay, I have an idea. Who's a central character? Then I ask myself a lot of questions about that character. What do they want? What do they need? How is what they want in conflict with what they really need? Sometimes I'll do something like figure out the 5 Ps: person, premise, plot, place, period. And then just do a lot of deep diving into all of those things. And then with screenwriting, it's often like, what is the central conflict? What's the inciting incident that makes this story start? You know, her husband is gunned down in front of her. That's an inciting incident that creates a need for her to find out why, find out who, get revenge or something. So it's often like once you have like a notion, you're just interrogating it basically as much as possible. And slowly through these questions, you start to, I love structure, and I think structure is so important. That's how you keep audiences coming back. That's how you keep them coming back after an ad break, because you're like, oh my God, I've got to come back and see what happens next. So you start to build. I start with character because I think that's the most important thing. But then you start to build who they are, where they are, what they want, what are the things the obstacles that can prevent them getting what they want. And then you start to build that around a structure. In a cinematic film, it's sort of, broadly speaking, 3 acts. So you're like, okay, what's the big turning point at the end of Act 1? What's the flip the script moment at the midpoint? So I think it is just a process of just incrementally adding layers until you know the story. Sometimes you'll know the end, but you have to build the rest of it. And then in just real practical terms, then I usually write a 1-pager of just like, briefly, what is this? And I move to a sort of outline, which is a longer document, where you flesh out plot, character, story, location, thematic underpinnings. Broadly speaking, I try, even in a very small way, to be saying something about the world. So it's not just an entertainment, which is valid. And then from treatment, outline, scene by scene, every scene kind of worked out. So that by the time I get to write the script, I can write that quite quickly because I've done so much work and I know what's in every scene. And so you're just plugging it all in. I mean, the real business of screenwriting is rewriting. So you have the first draft, you take a minute, and then you just start to revise it. What works, what doesn't. You know, you do a couple of passes yourself. Then you either have your peers who read your work with you, or you send it to my agent, or if it's already been sold to the producer, and they have their notes, and then the network has their notes, and then finally at some point, either it slowly dies a death or it gets greenlit. The green lighting is rarer. And then a new whole section starts, because it's never a finished script, because a script is a blueprint for the actors, for the director, for the costumes, for the locations. So then you start building again, and then you shoot it, and then the actor interprets things differently. And then in post, you reinterpret the script again with the editor. So until the final thing you see kind of has elements of the script. Sometimes it has a lot of them, but other times in post, you've completely rechanged the structure. So that's the journey, really, I think.
My first question I wanted to ask you is, in your opinion, what makes TV an interesting medium for storytelling?
At its best, I think TV puts you into to a world with characters that you can stay with for a very long time. You know, whether it's ER, where you're with certain doctors for 16 seasons, or, you know, Grey's Anatomy, or even, you know, like Game of Thrones, you follow a narrative and you follow people and you take them into your life and your world, not just for the 6 hours it takes to read a book or the 90 minutes, 2 hours you watch a film, but at its best, you really do get to follow a narrative and do a deep dive into character and action driven by desire and why people are the way they are. And I think that can give some of the most interesting insights into people. And also it's a box that's in everyone's house, you know, or on everyone's phone these days, you know, but it is a way in which you can connect the punch of story, the way in which you can connect with audiences, the way in which, if you're trying to do something that people haven't seen before, in which the immediacy of it, I think, is really important as well, in which people get to see themselves and see their stories and live in the world with people who become their friends and sometimes their family. And I think that does separate it out from other mediums. That's TV at its best.
I just wanted to ask about Inventing Anna. This was a series I watched recently, actually, and I really, really enjoyed that. I guess my question is sort of, can you share your experience of how you brought Anna Delvey, the main character, to life, and what challenges you faced?
So Inventing Anna was created by Shonda Rhimes, so I was on her writing staff for the show. It's based on a viral article, as with so many things these days. It was an article, I think, in The Cut or New York Magazine. It was New York Magazine, Jessica Pressler. And so there was already so much interest around the story. So Shondaland and Shonda won the rights to that. And I in terms of it being based on real events, we had access to all the court records. So again, you're not making things up in the sense that you've just got stacks of court records, every, you know, jury selection, who was on the jury, who got removed from the jury because they fell asleep. You had lots of backstory about her, but she is kind of a cipher character. And the experience was quite interesting because we read so much about her, and then you had to distill that. And when you're in a writer's room, which is very much the American model of television writing, you're there to service the showrunner's vision. And Shonda's vision for her for the show was very much about telling, like, it wasn't a kind of a traditional sort of a story over 10 episodes, but it was actually about a web, because that's how she was able to carry out her con. So every episode was sort of like the money, the fashion, the people, you know, the different elements of it, so that it was more a composite picture of someone running a massive scam. And I thought that was interesting. So the episodes, broadly speaking, are operated in a kind of, they were each their own mini movie about her. And so we all, you know, I think I did one of the money episodes, episode 4. So I just deep dived into all the records we had about that, all the interviews we had about that. And because it was based on an article by Jessica Pressler, we had all her notes, and she had lots of access, and she'd recorded lots of interviews, all these people. So you're sort of interpreting, you're changing names, you're changing locations, because Netflix legal are like, too close, this person, you know, we own their life rights, we don't own their life rights, we can't potentially defame. And so it was a really interesting and very different way of working, because you have so much source material, and then at a certain point you just have to say, okay, I know what's important here, ignore the rest, and then focus on, now what's the story I'm telling? Who is this woman in this episode? What does she want? What's stopping her? And how do I tell that in as an entertaining and page-turning and propulsive a way as possible? I mean, the challenges mainly were sort of filming in New York in winter, which is absolutely freezing, really long shooting days. And then we got caught, you know, we got shut down in like March 2020 because the pandemic and New York had hit. But I think it was a really interesting project, given how much interest there was in her, and how, you know, it was a kind of, you know, while we were writing, the verdict came down. So we're like, stop writing, we need to go and find out what's happened, kind of thing. So it was interesting.
My next question to you is, in terms of your show Riches, which was written and directed by you, and how it showcases facets of the Black British experience, what would you say your experience growing up as Black British was in London, Oxford, and perhaps how that has changed as you've grown up and moved? My experience, you know, how one views one's experience kind of changes. And so I think I would say I had a relatively, you know, I was born in London. My parents moved briefly to Nigeria. So I lived in Nigeria for a few years, but I was mainly in London from like when I was 8 or 9.
went to, you know, normal state schools in North London at a point where, you know, I went to Catholic school, so everyone was pretty diverse. It was everything from Irish to Greek to Italian. It was just the common denominator being the Catholic faith. I think I had a fairly sort of normal London upbringing with parents who, you know, I grew up in a relatively working class neighborhood. Edmonton is that, but my parents had very middle class aspirations and had come from quite middle class backgrounds in Nigeria. So the whole thing about lawyer, doctor, engineer was very much about that. I grew up in, you know, more than anything, books and TV were sort of my main friends, as it were. You know, I had lots of friends, but I loved burying myself in books and narratives. And I think Oxford for me became a thing because I would open so many books and I would say William Boyd was educated at Balliol College, Oxford. You know, all that stuff in terms of like, okay, this is what writers do. They go to Oxford to do that. So I'm like, fine, I'm going to do that. So, which wasn't a typical aspiration to have in Edmonton, and certainly wasn't hugely supported by my secondary school. So when I got my GCSEs, I was like, cool, I'm going to a college where people do go to Oxbridge from there, and there's more of a path. So but yeah, so I think how it's informed my work is all the shows I loved growing up, I loved them, and, you know, wholeheartedly. And the fact that I would be watching Sam Beckett, a white man from New Mexico in America, didn't matter. I loved those stories. You know, the fact that I'd watch Andrew Davies's adaptations for the BBC of all the Jane Austens and stuff. Again, I loved those stories. But at a certain point, you do start to wonder, and I did start to wonder, where are the Black people in these stories? And also the sort of ways in which we were siloed into very particular appearances in British dramas, which is very gritty, either very much supporting roles or background roles, or as a lot of my actor friends used to call it, blackground roles, or just, you know, there's one show about knife crime, but actually in a community where you're like, we're all trying to be teachers and lawyers and social workers, where are our stories and where are we as main characters? So I think to the extent that it informed my, and you know, crucially, we got cable around that point. And so most of the Black characters I saw on television were American. And so a lot of like my understanding of what it meant to be Black meant American shows. So there wasn't a British framework really. And so to some extent, I've always been clear that I write the world as I see it and as I experience it, which is ethnically very diverse on so many fronts in a way. And so it's just putting that on screen. And it's not something I labor the point. It's just I write the stories I know, but I also don't write, well, let's say I don't write stories in a world where someone like me couldn't exist. And I think that's true because I also just written a sci-fi movie, and I'm like, having watched hundreds of episodes of Star Trek, I'm like, we can time travel too. It might not be a comfortable experience. We're going backwards, but you know, it's just about experimenting and doing the stuff, putting yourself in the picture, I think.
Yeah, that leads on quite well actually to my next question, which is, how do you address diversity and representation within writing? Do you think the industry is making progress in this, where you see more Black actors being the main actors in shows?
I think the issue of representation in the entertainment industry is it's multi-pronged, because it's not just about what you write and who's in front of the camera. It's also about who gets to commission what we get to see. It's also about who's directing and who's producing. So the question about are we making progress, I think there's always there's potentially a rush to congratulate oneself. I think time will tell. In 20 years, let's look back and see if any of the progress sticks, because often there've been historical moments where you have a peak and new innovations, and then suddenly they're gone a year later. So I think I don't want to speak about whether progress is sticking. In 20 years, we'll see but how do I approach it in my writing? I don't think about it as an approach, really. I do think about just writing stories about human beings. And obviously with something like Riches, where it's specifically a Black-owned business, then that informs who the family is going to be. But actually around them, I was like, they do have a lawyer who's a white guy. You know, there's just, so it's not, I don't really subscribe to sort of tokenism. I think if you're writing someone of a particular ethnicity, then engage with that. What does that mean? But beyond the writing, it's about, who is your casting director? Who are your commissioning editors? With Riches, I was very clear that especially given the subject matter, it was about ensuring that the production felt as diverse as what was on screen. And that was about having Black HODs. It was about having Black, I made a decision that would be all Black directors, myself included, and that's sort of what we stuck to. Often when you make those decisions, you're combating historical and present day structural obstacles. So, for instance, my head of sound was a Black man who was BAFTA nominated, who's been BAFTA nominated for multiple shows and has come up. But, if you don't get Ron in sound, you're not getting any Black person because no one else has been trained up. There's that kind of the one. And the way sort of production in the UK has moved, where Netflix and Amazon are coming in with even bigger budget and snapping up the best. And obviously the American mandate is more focused on more inclusive hiring practices. So often the person I'd want to hire already had a great big whopping job on like Lord of the Rings for the next 18 months. So I also thought it was important to, we had, a music supervisor trainee who was a Black guy who was learning from a very experienced white trainee music supervisor. So creating the opportunities, but I'm also wary about everything being about a scheme or a course, because people, whether women, people of color, just want to be hired and to be given the chance to do the job, and should also be given the chance to fail at the same rate as anybody else and learn and rebound from that. So I think my approach is, it's not really a conversation, it's what we're going to do. And then we do that. And if we can't do that and we can't execute, then we've got to discuss why that is. It proves difficult in film because often how films are cast is very much about who's meaningful in the marketplace, who has opened a film before. And so it's a chicken and the egg. You write a film that has a Black woman lead. And they're like, well, who's a 24-year-old, 25-year-old, 30-year-old Black actress who's opened a studio movie at over 100 million? You're like, well, since you've never cast anyone in that film, you're sort of in this sort of race. And so often in the UK, the conversation is, can Idris be in it? And you're like, well, it's an 18-year-old character, but sure, we could, so it is, you do come up against those obstacles in which you're trying to navigate something that you didn't build, and how do you break out of that is the challenge, really.
It's really interesting.
My next question is a bit of a shift away, but I wanted to ask, as a former Wadhamite, how did your experience at this college kind of lay the foundations for your current career, or was it something that was sparked in you earlier than coming to Oxford?
I definitely wanted to write before coming to Oxford. And I think the thing about, as a Wadhamite, but Oxford in general, is that it really opened my eyes up to possibilities. I suspect if I'd gone to any of my other choices to study law, I'd be a lawyer right now, or I'd be like, I'd been a lawyer for 10 years and then finally broken and figured out how to write or something. But genuinely, I think you come to Oxford and, I grew up in Edmonton. There were doctors and lawyers close by, or family members and teachers and stuff, but I didn't know any novelists. I didn't know any film directors. I didn't know any film editors. I didn't know what a cinematographer was, right? And then you come to a place like Oxford, which is, for good or ill, is a place where people from particular backgrounds are. And then one of the first people I met at college, you're just like, wait, what? You're acting in a film already? So you sort of start to think these possibilities are there. During my time, like there was, Roz Pike was an undergrad there, but she was also on a TV show. And you're sort of like, oh, people must do these jobs. And if I'm in the same university as them, like, I guess I can figure out a way. I think like Hillary Clinton was like our final year. So Oxford is a very big place and broadened, for me, definitely broadened my appreciation of where I could be in the world. And I think that was helpful. I think, Mr. Hackney being supportive of me, not being entirely on the track towards going to the bar or going to Slaughter and May was important. So I co-edited Dorothy's Lip. I wrote film reviews for Cherwell. I helped out on a short film here or there. I think those opportunities really just kind of cemented that this is what I'm passionate and excited about and will be happily up at 2 a.m. doing, rather than trying to figure out, I don't know, the trusts of law. Talata 1996 was one of those things I could never figure out. But, you know, so yeah, it gave me a freedom, really. And I think that's the best thing about the university.
That's good to hear you wrote for Chelwa. I wrote for the Chel one as well.
No, it's great. It's fun.
Yeah. So my last question is, what has been your favorite project to work on, and what made it a unique experience, and why did it resonate with you so much?
I mean, my first American project feels like a big deal because I'd been sort of trying but not getting, you know, lots of cul-de-sacs in my UK profession. One episode of Eastenders, but not another episode. You know, one episode of Casualty. How to Get Away with Murder was a really big deal for me. It was my first American job. You know, Viola Davis became the first Black woman to win an Emmy for that. She would later on win an Oscar. And it was, the scale of the American enterprise is really interesting, because in the UK, you're farmed out an episode, you write it in your pajamas at home and you send it back and you get notes. In the US, you know, I mean, the first thing is the importance of the law degree. I'd spent a decade running away from my law degree, trying to avoid ending up accidentally going back to become a lawyer. And then I had this meeting in America, and at some point I realized that I needed to write a script. I'd had all these scripts that people liked. And I was like, I need to write a script that, how to phrase this? There is an assumption if you say you have a law degree from Oxford that you know lots about the law. I probably know marginally more than the average person who reads the Times law section. But it's so much a part of like building a writing career is like, people need to be able to say, I'm writing a list of people who are great on science and this, and that's that person. And I was like, okay, I need to get on she writes thrillers, legal thrillers really, really well. And of course she has a law degree. So I was like, what is that script that's going to tell them that the whole time? So I wrote a script. It was sort of inspired by a woman called Constance Briscoe, who was a Black judge in the UK who got herself in some bother and ended up going to jail for perjury, I believe. So I wrote the script that lots of people loved. I wrote it for the BBC. They bought it and then didn't make it. But I had the script and I sent it to this American agent who'd sort of been like, what they call it, back pocketing. They haven't signed you, but they're sort of saying, keeping an eye on you. And that script suddenly was a thing that opened lots of doors in America for me. So having spent ages being like the person who's like, I'm a TV writer, I don't want to mention the law ever, it became like, she's a law expert. And How to Get Away with Murder is a legal procedural about a law professor and her murderous students. And so that's a big deal for me because it was my first American job. It was like that thing about you drive onto a studio lot and you have a parking space and you have an office that has your name on it, and you go to a writer's room with a whole bunch of other people. But also, again, it's that thing about learning. I'm on one show, but everyone around me has been on major shows, has been on True Blood, have been on, so you're learning the lessons of lots of other shows. So that's an important one. I think probably the career milestone is Riches. I created it, wrote it. It was me kind of coming back home to England to utilize all the skills I'd learned in all the years in America. And it means a lot because I finally did the thing that I'd always wanted to do. I put a show on British television about predominantly British characters who are Black, but it's about their lived experience. And as much as there are obstacles, it's not all about trauma. And I don't feel like I'd seen that before. And it was kind of an attempt at a glossy, high stakes, quite American in feel television show, but of a type that I think we can do, but we just don't often do them. So I feel incredibly proud of it. I directed on it. I exec produced, and you know, there's lots of things in terms of what personally it meant to me to make the show, which was like, I created it. It wasn't based on IP, and I saw it through. But there's other moments where you walk on set and there are like 150 people doing work, and that sense of which something I did created all these jobs at a point during COVID where so many people in the business were out of work. You know, I felt very confident that there was so many women and people of color on that set, and that was based on the decisions that I fought for. And so I think, you know, I don't often think in terms of like be the change, but I felt really proud of myself on that first day. We're filming in Hackney. where our sort of, what do you call it, our meals prepared by local businesses, but so many people in work. So I think that's the one where, to the extent that one can't control much in the business, but when you do have the opportunity to make the changes you want to, you do them. I am really proud of that. And I think the response has been great as well. And it played in sub-Saharan Africa, it played in North America. There was like the thing was, there was a billboard both in Times Square and Sunset Boulevard. And you just think, okay, well, doing okay, having spent many years feeling like, oh my God, you should have been a lawyer. So that's a big one for me.
I wanted to ask you about the WGA strike that happened early this year. And with the strike having ended, what does this mean for you and future screenwriters?
I think the strike was incredibly important because in the sort of decade in which streaming has become such a part of all of our lives, there have been, it's that kind of law of unintended consequences, but the consequences been a change in how we work, a change in how we're compensated, and those changes weren't even remotely fair or appropriate. Some of the working practices weren't great. So the strike was very necessary, though I think it has been and continues to be really difficult, especially if the actors are still on strike and then all the crew who aren't working. What it means to me is now, in terms of writing, you're kind of back at it, and people are like, I feel slightly like we're in Ben-Hur and we're all being whipped to kind of write, we need more scripts. I think for new writers, I mean, COVID created an interesting situation where you don't have to be in Los Angeles to be in a room, and the stream is also presenting a lot more work worldwide. You can be in an American room out of London, out of Brighton from your Zoom. I think there is going to be a contraction, not to do with the strike, but to do with inevitably, there's just so much content. In 2022, there were 599 scripted shows. We probably all know about maybe 10 of those. We probably watched 6 of those. So the kind of unsustainable growth, the kind of, venture capitalists just like throwing money at it and it can all fail, but one isn't sustainable. So that contraction will mean there's fewer new entrant opportunities, and it's going to be more challenging to find those opportunities. And whenever there's a contraction, the concern is obviously there's going to be rollbacks in terms of the gains made by women directors, by Black showrunners, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's just being vigilant to that stuff, really, and trying to navigate that contraction in a way that doesn't mean that we roll back to only a minuscule proportion of populations getting to make television.